Today I'll rank all 41 different Catan strategies together with my fellow Catan YouTuber and former #1 ranked Catan player in the world, DandyDrew. Ranking these strategies based on how well they would do if they were playing for the largest army. Higher on our tier list they go, the better we think they are. So let's begin. And we're going to start with the port strategies. Drew, I know you're very familiar with all the port strategies. So
yeah, port strategies are really good. I think it's going to depend on the resource of the port. So for instance, if you're playing Orweed Sheep and you have flexible Orweed Sheep ports, it tends to gel a little bit better than you having to port a bunch of wood and brick to buy development cards. But as a general rule, the OWS ports work really well with OWS. No shocker. I would honestly, when I first started playing and getting into strategy, I wasn't a really big fan of the Ore port because it felt very wasteful to me. I've learned to appreciate it more. You only have 3 tiles of ore. So in a sense, it's one of the more scarce resources on the board. So I think it is good in terms of your development cards and your city building, but I can't really put it at the top.
There's not a lot of situations where it's good, but when it's the right situation, it's very, very strong in my opinion, because people don't see it coming, and also because people know it's the weakest port, so people do undervalue it a little bit.
It's at the high of good for me, maybe a low strong.
I'm more towards barely playable with high upsides. On most boards, it's barely playable, but there's some boards where you think, now I have a strategy.
Yeah, I can see where you're saying it's barely playable. I'd say it's kind of in that in-between range, and it just depends on how much you actually have, which is going to give it the viability.
What are your thoughts on the wheat port strategy? Is it better than the ore port strategy in your book?
Absolutely. I think the wheat port is actually one of the best ports in the game. I would almost want to put it like high strong, but man, it really depends. That this is probably one of the most challenging content pieces I've ever had. What I like about the wheat port is that it's an accelerator for building cities. It's also an accelerator for building almost everything. So from that standpoint, if you have a really good wheat port, and especially if you're playing development cards, I think it just gels extremely well with that strategy. And you have 4 tiles of wheat, so your ability to bring more supply in and keep it moving is much greater. Versus one of the weaknesses of the ore port is you only have 3 tiles.
Exact. What I would also say is playing the wheat port strategy makes all the other strategies on the board weaker, because you're likely going heavy on the wheat, which makes it so that there's other players who don't have as much wheat, which creates trade. I think the wheat port strategy is the best of the port strategies, simply because you have a resource that's also very tradable. I would put it in strong here.
I agree, it's strong. What a port offers you is a certain level of independence. If you're reliant on the board for trades, like let's say you're missing wheat, it's a very difficult game. If the board stops trading in the late game, the wheat port really allows you to keep your hand moving and stay actionable.
What are your thoughts on the sheep port then? Like, is this like a good strategy, or?
I actually think for OWS, the sheep port is strong. A lot of times as the game goes on, the value of sheep goes down because you can use that early sheep to buy your development cards. And then in the late game, where people are trading less, you can port that sheep for more of the flexible, city materials or road materials.
Okay, I can see this. I can go with this. I think brick port is weaker than wood port simply because there's less on the board. Same with sheep, and especially if we're going largest army, might even be behind ore port.
I would almost want to teeter this one into the barely playable category. Should we make a caveat here about your overall ratios? Should we say at least 40% plus of your production is in that resource?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. With that caveat, do you think the brick port should be in a better tier than barely playable then?
Nah, probably not. Nothing here is unplayable, but I do think it's probably the weakest of the 5 in terms of honing in on army and development cards.
Yeah, but I do think the wood port is good. I just feel like it's much more likely that you'd have more with the wood port than the brick port, just because there's more cards of it on the board. It makes it so that trades are more likely to happen with this.
So I have a little bit of a hot take here. I actually prefer the wood port over the ore port.
Yeah, I can see that.
So one of the aspects here is that you do have more tiles, so more potential opportunities. But one of the things that works really well with the wood port is it's also used to build roads pretty fast, right? Because for instance, let's say you only have Orweed Sheep and you have a wheat port, you need 4 wheat to drop a road. But with the wood port, you would need 3 wood to drop a road. So, of course, you're not building a ton of roads, but you still need to be able to get settles and to get places on the map with an OWS setup regardless.
Yeah, that's a good point. I would also argue is that it's easier to do a double play with wood port than with an ore port.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the city plus road strategy. So when you have ore, wheat, and some road building with brick and wood, but specifically no sheep in settlements, and also you don't really build into sheep later. It doesn't have a 2-for-1 port, but but it does have a 3-for-1 port.
It's funny, like I know this setup's been talked a lot about, but I feel like I don't see a lot of people win with this strategy. Not to say it's not viable if you play it. Maybe it is kind of like a dark horse, right? Like a lot of people don't think about it or maybe don't see it in their strategy placements. I do love the combination. I definitely think it will work, but to say it's like off the charts strong, I can't put it there. So it's in good for sure, but I'm not quite sure where I want to put it quite yet.
I think if we're specifically going for the largest army, I don't think it's even good. It works really well in situations where you don't really have road competition. The problem with most road setups is that you cannot get cities fast enough. This is exactly the type of setup that does that very well. So when you're going for the longest road and there's no road competition, I would even argue that it's broken. But when you're going for the largest army, well, there's typically 1 or 2 strategies that are better equipped to do this.
Yeah, I think in that context with the largest army, I'd say it's not playable. One thing that everyone should keep in mind here is everything depends, right? Like we are kind of making very fast generalizations on every setup here. I mean, there's a lot of different factors that can change a setup to be like barely playable to strong to even broken.
Yeah, the 4 resource strategy is up next. I'm actually not a huge fan of this one, especially not when going for largest army. And this is the 4 resource strategy. It just has 4 resources. It doesn't build into ore. It does have a 3-for-1 port that it builds into. It has most likely high production, otherwise it doesn't make any sense to play it at all.
I'll tell you this, it takes a very skilled player and somebody who has a lot of board awareness to make this setup work for a competitive army game, right? Because you're gonna have to trade for the ore and or port for it. Like out of the box, I don't think it's that great for army, but I actually think at least having 4 out of the 5 resources is a nice place to be. So I think it's maybe at the front of barely playable. We probably want to put the city road strategy at the end of good.
Yeah, because you can 3-for-1 for the sheep, right? Like you can still...
Exactly.
I do agree with it. I do think the 4 resource strategy is the worst we have covered so far.
I think actually a good insight here as well, Treek, is the fact that we've actually put the ore port kind of low in terms of the 2-for-1 ports, but it's not because ore is bad. It's so valuable that we don't want to port it. So that's why I think the 4 resource strategy is so difficult, is because without the ore, it really does make your ore wheat sheep game much more difficult.
With this next setup, you start with the 4 resources, but you build into the ore. And you can have a 3-for-1 port later as well. I do think it differs a little bit than especially with 4 resource strategy. I'm not too big of a fan because I typically like having ore right away instead of building towards it, especially going for the largest army, but because you just fall behind in the army at the early games.
Yeah, I'm gonna say this a lot. It depends. One thing that happens a lot in the early game is the OWS player or the most dominant or prominent player gets blocked. So from that standpoint, you know, if a couple 7s start to hit, that competitor who's starting with the ore might get hit the most, which gives you enough time to build your position up, get to the ore, and then actually become competitive. I definitely think it's in the good category, maybe on the lower end of good.
Yeah, okay, I can see that. One thing I did want to mention that, like, it depends on what type of game there's being played. If it's more a German style where people don't give in to extortions, there's a lot less room to get trades for resources you don't produce. But if you're more on the American style of playing Catan, you do get a lot more of these creative deals where a lot more trades happen, including extortions. In that situation, I feel like 3 resource combinations, 4 resource combinations without ore work a bit better than when that doesn't happen. I'm definitely happy with putting this here.
To me, the thing that's going to change where that moves is how fast you get to the ore. So for instance, let's say in your placements you have everything but the ore, but you start with a road, like you're practically just getting a settle away from being on the ore and being competitive. In that sense, it's almost like you never really missed the ore if it took you 1 or 2 orbits to get there. And also, is the ore shared? Because like, for instance, if you get onto a shared ore and the OWS competitor can block it, it actually becomes less valuable because you can't get the engine running. Versus maybe you're sharing that ore with another OWS competitor, at least you're equalizing the ore production between you and that person.
Yeah, or maybe it's triple shared and it barely gets blocked anytime.
I think there's a lot of factors, but
absolutely.
It's certainly good.
Yeah, so this is the strategy I had in mind for the broken spot. It's called the Invincible 5. So basically, this only happens when your opponents don't pick the correct placements. So you start off with the 659 or wheat wood, and then for some reason there's a wheat brick sheep 8510 left for you as your 8th settlement.
Well, I mean, by definition, it has to be broken.
Yeah. This is basically the type of setup where you think like, okay, what did players do to give him that setup? This doesn't happen too often.
I think there's a really nice insight here, Treek, to also realize like the value of your setup, it's a board collaboration. What you do is also going to dictate the value of other people's setups.
Oh, absolutely. If you pick a setup like this, you know for the rest of the game, you should get blocked. And that also means that other players, there might be another opponent who has a good setup as well. They will go untouched for perhaps a large portion of the game. What we discussed before is that broken and barely playable, the difference isn't as big because the barely playable setup won't get blocked as much as the broken setup.
And pacing too, like for instance, certain players that are, let's say, in the good or barely playable, if you're good at deal making, communication, you can get good deals, and they might even try to feed you army so that the broken setup or the strong setup doesn't take over. There's going to be a big skill jump depending on who's playing what.
Yeah, absolutely. The other setups we're going to discuss next are also part of the Orby cheap category. So one of them is full Orby cheap, so where you only have ore, wheat, and sheep. There's hybrid Orby cheap with wood. There's hybrid Orby cheap with brick, and there's hybrid Orby cheap with wood and brick, but then they're both quite on the low side, so I don't really see them as an invincible 5 where you have good of everything, but I don't see them as a 5 resource setup either, because they're very focused on the Orby cheap. We're going to assume average dice rolls in here. Do you feel like there's much difference between the hybrid Orby cheap variations?
I think having that touch of wood and brick, it's pretty similar in function. Maybe the wood's just a tad bit better because you do have more hexes and more opportunities to potentially pick up wood for deals or trades or ports even. But I definitely think it's above full OWS. I just think from a flexibility standpoint, I'd rather have a little bit of road building to keep my setup moving.
Yeah. I generally do think the hybrid Orby cheap plus road setup is the best one. Not because I rely on the dice rolls as much, but when you don't produce a resource, people are more hesitant to trade you that resource. But if you do, even if it's on a very low number or a very weak number like an 11, people are less hesitant to trade you that resource.
It's going to depend on the level of opponents. I mean, I would prefer, like I said, to have a solid OWS and a little bit of road building to work with. I would say the full OWS is at the front of good.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would expect to see it higher.
To me, it's on the edge. It can have a foot in strong and a foot in good, depending on the board. But I wouldn't put it in front of the ports, personally. There's something to be said about metas. If I'm playing in Discords, which is where I kind of really got my game going, the full OWS can be countered in a lot of different ways. If you're playing, let's say, your family, it's probably the most broken setup you're going to get because you're just going to crush them. To me, I've been a competitive player, and that's been my standpoint, is that the full OWS does have some downfalls and can be easily countered with good communication. I have a hard time saying it's super strong.
I do think when you're playing ranked online, I would definitely put it as very good. And also because I do think full Orby cheap is currently less focused than hybrid Orby cheap. Full Orby cheap has this advantage that if it has 2 of each resource, it's very difficult to stop from getting development cards. And it makes other strategies worse because full Orby cheap, it's very difficult to win largest army against. Setups that are going for largest army can be port strategies, can be Orby cheap strategies. Have to find different ways to win, and that is like a factor of the full Orby cheap as well, which I think doesn't get talked about enough.
Maybe there's even worth creating a distinction here. If you're saying full OWS and it's 2 ore, 2 wheat, and 2 sheep, that's a lot different in my mind than saying like I have all ore, wheat, sheep, but let's say I have like 3 tiles of wheat, 1 of ore, a bunch of sheep, right? Like I think the ratio and the diversity mix matters.
Yeah, okay. I wouldn't take full Orby cheap if it's just 1 ore tile. So I would only take it if it's at least 2 ore and 2 wheat tiles. Otherwise, I'm not gonna take full Orby cheap.
In that sense, then, I would definitely put in strong.
Okay. In that sense, I'm definitely putting it ahead of sheep as well.
It's a tough one for me. I wouldn't say it's the strongest of the strong. You want it to be very strong, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Like,
Go for it.
Yeah,
I can definitely see the case there. I have to put a caveat here because I started out as an Orweed sheep player, and I still play a lot of Orweed sheep, but I had a situation where in a tournament I pulled like 8 nights in a row and I lost on a final table. That trauma of losing a big game actually pushed me into trying other setups. So maybe I'm also a little biased against going for Orweed sheep just because, you know, I've had some funny wins or funny losses in that way.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. I started out with seafarers. There isn't much much of a metagame in Seafarers regarding Orby Cheap. Well, it's still developing. So I didn't prioritize ore when I started out. I think Orby Cheap is something I learned more later on, but because I had experience with all these other ways of doing setups, I had an advantage.
I will just close out this one because it is Orby Cheap's important. I think it could be literally at the beginning of strong and also at the beginning of good, depending on the situation. But I'm happy to leave it as very strong because generally it is.
So now we're talking more about the hybrid Orby Cheap versions. Do you think wood or brick same tier, or?
Yeah, they're very similar, I think, in function. I mean, I would give it maybe a little bit of a touch more to wood. I'm a little bit biased there, but maybe somewhere in the middle of good.
Okay, well, you're not very high on the Orby Cheap setups, are you?
It's just also tough too because all these setups I've played and had success with, right? So it's kind of like I have so much in my mind about trying to run different scenarios to where it'd be very strong and also trash.
Yeah, there's so many different ways we could do these tier lists. Like we could do them based on level of competition, based on how we're doing them now, all of them combined.
For army, I'm probably underestimating that a bit. I could also see them being maybe towards the end of strong as well.
I would perhaps put them in broken. If I go ranked, I get this. Good luck stopping me. But I can see in more tournament setups, people are aware of it more. There's no way it's broken in the tournament setup. Like that's the thing. But like online ranked, even against top players, I would put it in broken.
No, you're probably right. I think if we're putting full OWS as very strong, then I think hybrid has to be in front of that. I don't really like a lot of things in broken because I just don't think Catan works that way. But no, I think you're right. I think if you just have a really good OWS and you just have that nice touch of wood and brick, it works out nicely.
Perhaps you have like a 6, 11, 12 in mind, and I have an 8, 5, 10 in mind, right?
Exactly.
That could matter so much.
Yeah, I guess we could also think, what is the best case scenario for these setups? Where would you put it?
I'm going with top 20% of setups I've had with this.
I think that's fair then.
I don't like the 5 resource setup. It does way too much of everything, but I see in tournament play, it does often win. So it might just be the thing that I'm just not very good with the 5 resource setup. And it might also be because I tend to go more for the longest road with the 5 resource setup, but here we're specifically going for army. So I don't know, do you go with the 5 resource setup at all? Like,
yeah, I love it. It's something I've been saying a lot recently is a lot of this game is style related. Like there are certainly situations where there is a right move or let's say an optimized move, but there is an aspect of how you want to play the game and how you want to cater to strategy. I could see if we're talking about purely going for army, personally, I would put it at like the front of good.
I can be with that.
The flexibility of having all 5 resources, to me, does offer potential speed and momentum. Now, there's also something to be said, if you're a newer player, 5 resources is a really good way just to stay independent, to where like you don't have to hunt down trades every turn to make your setup actionable. I think it is flexible in the sense like you can choose a different path. You can go for army or you can go for road. I think 5 resources is very good.
I think what it does well is it can capitalize on often one of the players on the win conditions that's struggling. So with the 5 resource setup, you can build a production and then choose and analyze the board and say, well, we thought there was going to be a really strong army player in this game. It turns out they had a weak start, so let's capitalize.
What do you think about the threat perception of a 5 resource setup? Do you find that because in your mind they're not like they're a jack of all trades, master of none, you would agree that they probably get less robs and steals?
No, I think they get more robs and steals. Yeah, I think the threat perception is quite high because I see so many comments people make, well, they have 5 resources. They have a much better setup than I do. Some people believe it, some people don't believe it. Some people like me are on the opposite side of this idea, but I think the 5 resource setup generally, and that's partially the reason I don't like it, has an overvalued threat level.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I guess it depends on the arena, like where you're playing specifically.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think especially in the discords, like the super competitive discords, I mean, OWS is king, so it gets treated as such. My experience is it doesn't get blocked as much as OWS.
Yeah, I agree. And it's why I think it's in a good spot in the top of good.
I hope, Treek, as you know, we play more games and we get to know each other better. I'd like to push your perception of the 5 resource setup a little bit further.
I hope so too, because that's the setup I need to learn more about, because like there's a reason I'm not doing well with it. A setup that does work extremely well with my style is the road builder setup. And I define the road builder as you have a ton of wood and brick, at least 5 production points of each, and you have wheat, ore and sheep, but not all of them, 2 of them. Common theme is that you have strong wood and brick and the others are lacking a little bit. If this is in the game, there's no way another player takes the longest road.
So if we're specifically talking about army, though.
Yeah, okay, yeah, we're talking specifically about army, so this is absolutely unplayable.
Well, no, I mean, I wouldn't say it's trash. I have a hard time putting anything here in trash just because the nature of variance and the nature of Catan. Like, I do think for army, though, it's probably on the lower end of good, like near the city road strategy. Like, they're very similar, I think, in principle, or at the beginning of barely playable.
I don't see how this wins because you also struggle to get cities. The reason why I like this setup so much is because, like, my biggest strength is getting a city early game, I think. This works extremely well with that because it's the biggest challenge for this setup. If you also need to get army with this setup and you don't have a 2-for-1 port, that's not going to work. I could see you making a double play where you first secure the longest road and then take the largest army because you're doing so well. But then the primary goal of it is still to take the longest road and you can find some points later on. But
yeah, it's going to come down to the ports, I think. If you can, I mean, you could definitely need at least a 3-for-1 just to stay like ultimately flexible across the wood and the brick. Probably not the best army setup. Like I said, I don't think anything belongs in trash, but if you feel that passionately about it, then it probably should be there.
It's such a specialist setup. This is designed to take the longest road. It's designed to not take the largest army. What are your thoughts on would we cheap for largest army?
Absolutely love it.
Broken. No.
Broken. Yeah, it needs its own tier. This one can fluctuate from good to strong to me because it's going to depend on the competition. It's going to depend on the start of the game. And are we talking primarily you only have those 3 resources?
Yeah, and you can have a 2-for-1 port if you want.
I think it's definitely at the front of good. Yeah.
I'm pretty high on it too, but for me, I only take it when there's not that much army competition. So this is in the case that the board is set up for it well. If that's the case, I think picking this and you can get on the 2-for-1 port, I find it a very strong strategy, but I also don't think it's for everyone, but like it does depend on like it depends on your trading skills and your board awareness, your player's hands, your awareness of the player's hands and such.
Also the value of the wood too. If there's a lot of brick on the board and you have the dominant control of the wood and you can make some early trades to get yourself to a port, it makes that even sweeter.
Absolutely.
I find as a good rule, like I think this is fair to say, anytime you're lacking or wheat or sheep, it's considered to me to be a little bit more of an advanced setup. Yeah. You have to trade better, you have to make better deals, you have to be a lot more optimal with your cards. But I think it has a lot of potential and it's fun to play to me.
Yeah. So on that statement, I'm not sure about the sheep board. For example, I don't think city plus road is advanced at all. Like, I think it's one of the easier strategies to play.
I think the sheep port just caters really nicely to the fact that the game is very straightforward, right? You're just buying development cards. And the consequence of that is you're probably going to get army if you can pop like crazy.
Yeah.
In that standpoint, it's very easy to get army with a sheep port. Now, is it always winning? Well, no, but
yeah, I do agree with it. And also many people are much more inclined to give the largest army to the would be cheap player than the or be cheap player. It just gets better as the game progresses.
That's also kind of like a meta thing too, though, right? To be able to know your trade potential with the setup.
Could you elaborate?
Let's say you have 2 players that are fighting devs. You have an or wheat sheep player, and then you have someone with wood, wheat, and sheep. The board perception is that the guy with the wood is not as strong for army. So usually that player with the wood is probably going to get more favorable deals to balance the game out for the other 2 players.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
I like the threat perception of the wood, wheat, sheep setup.
Yeah, me too. So a setup I don't see a lot happen actually is wood, brick, and wheat. I do think I've seen you play it.
For sure, but I wouldn't say that caters very much to army.
No.
This is where I feel pretty confident when you're missing both the sheep and the ore that it's probably in the barely playable category.
Barely playable, not trash? Can you win?
I don't like to say it's trash because you never know what the trading dynamic is, right? Like maybe you can get a ton of ore and sheep trades, or maybe you can get a bunch of trades for one of the resources and port the other. But you're going to struggle, I think, to get army and probably hold it if you do.
I think it's trash.
But it's the nicest trash, man. What is it? Or wood brick? I think it has similar functions as the other one too.
Yeah. Which one do you like more? Or wheat brick or wood brick?
I think the wheat's better here.
Wheat's better?
Yeah, it's kind of similar to how we put the wheat port in front of the ore port. I think that's a similar reasoning.
Yeah, absolutely. The next setup is the alternative OWS or wood sheep.
So like in this case, would you be taking the wood to a 3-1 port and working that angle as well?
Yeah, it depends, right? If you have a 2-for-1 port, this gets a lot more playable than with the 3-for-1 port. But I don't even know, like most likely have a lot of production of each of these resources. So a 3-for-1 port might actually be better than a 2-for-1 wood port with this.
It's good, you know, maybe that's where it belongs. I think for a lot of players, playing without wheat is very difficult. Not that it's impossible, but I think it's a very nuanced and more strategic way that you have to play the game. So for that reason, I would not recommend it to most players. Maybe it's towards the lower end of good, in my opinion.
Do you think it's better than a brick port strategy?
I think so. Again, I don't know what the makeup is of all your resources with the brick port strategy, but I think if you're really playing without wheat, it is more nuanced. So it's like, I think if you just give that strategy to a random player, they're probably not going to make it work that well.
For most players, it's barely playable.
That's probably fair. Yeah. I think it's important for everyone to remember, like, any of these setups can fluctuate from, like, let's say 3 to 5 positions, depending on the situation.
Yeah. So we're thinking largest army, so it might be bottom good, but
that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. Okay. Let's do this.
Something I love to do is, like, you know, you can place out a board a lot of times and be right, but I like to take certain calculations and change it, right? Almost as a surprise factor. So there are situations where I'll put myself into an alternative OWS setup. Like, I might even go without the wheat, but if it really shakes the board up, then it might have a lot of value to me. Like the player who thinks they're getting that spot and they have a ton of wheat, like I might put them in a situation where they have to start trading me now.
Absolutely. I remember one of your games where you did this and one of your opponents first wanted to basically fight you for it, and then you mentioned, well, I can see why you're frustrated, but we could also just trade instead of you blocking me all game, and that worked. So that was interesting to see.
Yeah, I remember that now. And then what's the next one? OBS?
Yeah, that's or brick sheep. So instead of or wood sheep, you have brick instead of the wood.
Put it barely playable here. I think
barely
it's
playable.
Barely playable. It's like, I think so. Something like that.
Similar to brick port strategy, I think so. So instead of wood wheat sheep, you have brick wheat sheep. Does that matter that much, or do you feel like? I don't have that much experience with this setup. Like, it doesn't happen too often.
I think there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
Right? It's got to go in the barely playable category for me.
Yeah, I agree.
What's this one? This one looks like fun.
Yeah, these are some of my favorite setups. You do have ore and wheat, so you do have the best resources, but you don't have sheep and you don't have brick, but you do have wood. And this could be with a wood board, and this could also be with a 3-for-1 board. I feel like it works better with the wood board. It helps you city up faster.
To me, this is actually like very similar to the wheat, sheep, wood. Essentially what happens is the ore and the wheat obviously are used for your cities, but you take the wood and that becomes your sheep, right? You're porting or you're trading. To me, this is like in the middle of good. Somewhere in the middle, maybe just a little bit more closer to very good.
Yeah, I think so too. It depends on whether or not your opponents believe it's a good setup or not. If they don't, I think this is very good. If they do, then the ore and the wheat are blocked too often. Like this setup does need trades, and it does need to be undervalued a little bit.
So maybe for that reasoning, it needs to go in the middle somewhere. Fair enough. I'd say just put the brick one right below that.
So the new category is ore with cheap setup, but you have very low ore. Oh, it's hybrid ore with cheap, but you have very low ore.
I think right off the bat, I just feel like all of these are in just like the good category.
You initially wanted to put hybrid ore with cheap and good as well. So what makes you feel like these are as good? Like I don't like ore with cheap setups with low ore, to be honest.
The one way I look at this, and something I've taught a lot, is if I can get a port and turn that brick into a flexible resource, then that brick compensates for my lack of ore, and then now I have decent ratios. So like maybe I have a 3 or 10 ore, which is not a lot, but then what I can do is I can effectively turn all that wood and brick to turn it into more ore. I like from that standpoint, like thinking about my production in a ratio and balancing way.
Okay, I can see that. So I'm not as comfortable with low ore. If you're more experienced with this, I think this is worth following your take on.
Well, where would you put it?
I definitely think it's above alternative OWS. No, I think it's here for me.
So this is really telling us how much you value ore in that situation. Like
yeah, I think so.
Really is the deal breaker.
Yeah.
One way you could reframe your thinking about the game is it's all about the output of the cards you're getting. Like, let's say you don't have a lot of ore, but again, like if you can find ways to increase your output through porting and balancing your ratios, it kind of doesn't matter how much ore you have. It's how much you can create. Like there's a lot of times that I'll take a ton of wheat and sheep and just a little bit of ore, but I know I can hit a 3-1 and just churn all that into development cards. It's okay that I don't have that much ore. It's going to depend on the port for me. It's going to depend on the flexibility of my other resources. I can see a case for it being in the middle and being towards the end.
Okay. So here you have a hybrid ore with sheep with low wheat. Is that better or worse for you than the low ore?
I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I like the ore just because you need more ore for cities. Like it's 3 ore to 2 wheat. I'm not too thrilled about it personally. I always find when I have low wheat, I do have certain concerns like, is my wheat going to get blocked? Maybe from that standpoint, to me, it's not as strong. I do value wheat quite a bit with these setups.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. I would even say it's with low wheat, it's easier to get a city than with low ore. So I would put it ahead of the ore.
And this is where I think some styles come in because I love the flexibility of things like settles as well. Also, it just depends on what kind of game you want to play. Like, I like the ability to drop a lot of settles. But I guess if we're speaking specifically about ore weight sheep, it might be the slightly better play.
Yeah, that's also
I'll let you choose kind of the where you want to. I think you feel passionately about it. I find they're very similar, though.
It's a good point that, like, you can settle more if you have higher wheat. So you do have a bit more flexibility.
I think we're going to agree on the next category, though.
We do have hybrid ore with sheep, but we have low sheep.
It's got to be in front of the other 4.
Absolutely.
In my mind.
Absolutely.
It
also has to be in front, I think, of the ore, wheat, wood, and ore, wheat, brick.
That's fair. Yeah.
I also think it's in front of wood, wheat, sheep. I also think it's in front of 5 resource.
Hey, come on now. Give me the 5 resource strategy.
Okay. I'm gonna give you the 5 resource setup.
All right, thank you.
So far we have done wood ahead of brick. Do you feel like that's
been the common
still the
theme?
case?
Yeah.
Now we're going to the fun setups that I feel like haven't been explored enough. 2 resource setup for the largest army.
Okay.
Which do you feel like is not trash?
Any OWS 2 resource combination is not going to be trash. Like, it's going to be barely playable. I think the only thing that might be even in the category of good is wheat ore, but it's like the low end. And the reason I want to do this is because I've actually won a game with just brick and sheep. So I want to say that I won a game with the worst setup of all time.
let's put brick and sheep.
No. But all the way at the end.
Okay.
I do think it's probably the worst.
Yeah. Okay, so I did win one with wheat and wood, where I took the army, but I had a 12 ore as well, but it only rolled 3 times, I believe, in the game. So all my numbers were below average rolls as well. So that's my wildest win, I'd say.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is the fun thing is even though it might look really, really bad, a lot of setups still have a chance.
Yeah. So this ore wheat setup, I assume it has a port and it has like a lot of ore and a lot of wheat.
If you only have 2 resources and you have 6 hexes between them, it's very difficult to block.
Yeah.
So like you effectively, you should never be completely locked out of a resource if you only have 2 resources.
I find this difficult to put in good.
Well, it is at the butt of good, right? It's like the worst of the good.
The way I see this, like I see 2 commentators. Okay, they're gonna have ore and wheat. Like that's a good setup. I don't think that's ever gonna happen.
Really? Wow. I think in a competitive game, your ability to communicate, make deals. I mean, not to mention if you get like a 2-for-1 port with that, and you can be porting a ton of wheat.
Yeah, I think it's playable.
If you think about it, if you have a wheat port, you only need 3 cards. Sorry, you need 4 cards, right? Like let's say you need 3 wheat and an ore to buy dev. I think it's the worst of the good, personally.
Okay, I think it's the best of the barely playable.
Oh, we're in like the same boat. I'm happy with that. Yeah, I feel like we have really stacked good.
Okay.
I mean, to me, the distinction is it's pretty much the same.
Yeah.
Like,
so now we have some iterations to the setup. Some of them is just for fun, I guess. First, we have the wheat is for noob setup. You can play anything, but you're not allowed to place on wheat for the entire game.
It's gonna be tough for most players. I would usually not recommend it, especially for army.
Yeah.
I'd put like in the middle of barely playable.
Oh, really? I would put this in good, to be honest.
I'm picturing a certain situation, and I'm sure you're picturing one as well. I just think for a lot of players, dealing without wheat is a hindrance than it is a help.
Yeah, but like we also have the ore wood sheep in here.
That's true.
Yeah, like I'm also happy to put ore wood sheep in barely playable as well, but I think it should definitely be ahead of that one.
That's fair. I guess if we're comparing here, it's hard, man. This is one of the hardest things I've done.
Yeah, it's good mental exercise, absolutely. I tend to value ore a little bit more, and you tend to value wheat a little bit more.
I love building really good road setups as well. Usually the wheat caters to those, so there's a little bit of bias here.
You seem to be more focused on settlements, aren't you?
It depends. Yeah, I mean, the thing about settles is they tend to be very fast points, especially for a road player or let's say like a hybrid OWS. And to me, like this game is literally all about speed. It's like it's not who's going to get the 10 points. It's who's going to get the 10 points the fastest.
Okay, so for me, it's about staying under the radar. So I like saving up for a city. So I actually want to have less speed than my opponents, so I can sneak in the win later.
Yeah, I mean, I love that there are different approaches to the game. I mean, I think one of the things I learned is like I've learned how to deal with pacing hard and dealing with the fallout of that.
So then we have the first turn plow. So I imagine like you have a good 8-5-10 or be cheap as your first settlement, and you have the alternative to put it on a free hex spot as well with your second settlement, but instead you put it on a 9-12 wood brick to plow someone else to another setup. Do you feel like the first turn plow is any effective?
It depends on who you're plowing. If you're hurting your competitor, then I think that makes more sense. If you're hurting somebody who's not going to be competing on devs and you're just building like bad ill, I'm less likely to do it, because the last thing I want to do is I want to be blocked by my competitor and then blocked by the person who's angry that I plowed them.
Yeah, I tend to avoid confrontation as much as possible. So I am not comfortable with this setup at all.
You've got to be ready for the fallout if you do upset somebody.
Do you think it's a good setup?
I don't know if I would even call it a setup. I mean, it's more just like a decision. It is a setup. I would recommend usually trying to make friends early on if you can.
Yeah.
But if you have like a good ROE cheap and you're getting a good settle spot and you are hurting a player on the board, it's hard to say it's barely playable. I mean, it's certainly playable. I mean, I guess I'd put it on the lower end of good.
Yeah.
Maybe the last one of good.
I feel like a lot of players do have success with it. I'm just not comfortable with it. I think it's around here. I once made the start of this tier list with Shin's Law, and he added some strategies. The underproduction is where you don't have more than 19 pips of production or 18 pips of production or something.
My heart's saying to throw it in a trash immediately and close the lid, but it's going to depend on the ratios. Like if you have a decent balance of or wheat sheep and like your hand is going to be generally playable, then it might make up for the fact you're not going to produce a lot of cards.
Yeah.
But I don't recommend this very often.
Yeah, no, me neither.
I would just say throw it in trash and don't worry about it.
I think it's barely playable because you can win with it. Trash, I feel like you cannot win with it.
Yeah, but I think from a principle standpoint, I mean, I'm throwing in trash personally. But
you would just put it in the trash? Well, we have to close the trash as well, so this is the lid of the trash. Side by side, so...
Loaded! It's hard to say side by side is a specific strategy. Maybe it's like you said, a way of positioning yourself. I do find where it gets interesting is if you are playing OWS and you have the ability to connect with like a road builder or even just produce, wood and brick and go for a connect for road. That added flexibility of taking road is a nice thing to have.
I agree, especially when you're going for the largest army. I feel like it makes side by side stronger, but you do have to think about your opponent's targeting you simply because of how likely is that you're going to take longest road. So I feel like you're a better table talker in terms of defensive table talk than I am. So I'm not as comfortable with the side by side because the threat of the double play can sometimes be a lot for players. But if you can diffuse that tension, then it's very good.
This is probably why a lot of times if I'm playing side by side, I am playing it for a road. I've already got a really good resources for road, but then positionally speaking, it's set up for road too. But there's many times I played OWS with the side-by-side factor to it, and I've been able to have a lot of success. I mean, I got to put it somewhere higher on this list just for my own like self-preservation. I think for most players, you can throw it into somewhere in good. If you have side-by-side all wood and sheep, sorry, but you're not going to win the game.
Yeah. So
I do think the caveat is if you're playing or wheat sheep in some way, but you have the ability to connect, like it's a nice added bonus to your position.
I do think an advantage of the side-by-side is that you create that one spot that's double shared. People feel uncomfortable blocking you.
Solo blocking is much less. Yep.
Yeah, it doesn't happen as much. And it's also, it sets up in a way, especially if you do it at a coast, that there's only two spots that could be double shared as well. So it makes you very difficult to block.
that is something I discovered when I started playing that setup a lot. And I played it very aggressively in my early stages of like trying to figure out the strategy for it. Is that, yeah, you don't get blocked as much.
Yeah.
Just because most of your hexes are isolated on a certain corner of the board.
Yeah. Did you know that actually 3 years ago it was considered a downside because people did solo block much more?
Well, there's certain players that, because I was using it so often and getting good results with my style, that they would just solo block it early. That to them was just like, if I want to kill that setup, I'll just hit that shared 8 or that 3 or 10 or whatever's doubled up on.
Yeah.
And just try to kill it. It's not like a setup per se, but it is like a positional consideration. I think we got it though. We got the list.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I hope everyone enjoyed and learned something.
This was awesome. I appreciate it. And I mean, we could probably move some things around, but generally speaking, I think we hit it really well here. Treek, thanks, man. Really appreciate it. And love what you're doing as far as the content. So
thank you.
Excited to see more videos come out.
Absolutely. I hope to put out more, and definitely check out his content for the craziest ways to win on ranked games and tournament games. A lot of fun stuff as well.